There we go. Oh yes, there we go. It's recording. Right, okay. So, oh, somebody else has just arrived, so I'll just let them in and we'll get this PowerPoint started. I'm just ticking off names as people arrive. Okay, yes, so for the person that's just joined us, I'm Susan Simmons. I'll just make sure you're here. Yes, excellent. I'm Susan Simmons, working for Hampshire Wildlife Trust as an engagement officer. I do have a very bad cold today, so I might need to take a few breaks for a drink, but we are going to talk all about wildlife in school grounds. So now what we want to do, oh yeah, just very quickly, I'm sure everybody's really familiar with Zoom, but just in case you're not, we've got these little icons to turn your video on and off, to mute, put your hand up. But as I said, it's such a small group. Feel free to interrupt, to shout out at any time, that's fine. And we've got the chat function. If you prefer to write a question into the chat, that's fine. And we will be recording, which I've just explained, and it will be available on the Wildlife Trust YouTube channel and on the South Downs National Park website as well. So feel free to keep your camera off if you would rather not be recorded. So what we want to do this afternoon is we want to have a think about how to find out which species might be living in your school grounds, and to try and build some confidence in identifying them with the children using a number of different identification keys. And we're going to sort of hopefully learn a few tips on how to work with the class to identify some of these different species and integrate those into our curriculum teaching. So there are often within school grounds a huge number of habitats, actually, a lot of resources that we can use. In fact, sometimes things that people perhaps don't see as a habitat that can be used for learning. So, you know, some examples, we've got the Bug Hotel on the left here, which has obviously been created, but equally a very simple log pile or pile of rocks or stones could be useful for invertebrates. Now, some schools put bird feeders out, so obviously that's quite a nice thing to do. There may be areas of long grass, of vegetation, or it might be simply that you've got places for planters where you could have some herbs that are obviously useful for us, but also good for pollinators. And then there's things like a pond. If you've got space for a wildlife pond, then that would be fantastic. Now, I know some schools have ponds that have been neglected over time, and they're not quite sure what to do to get them back into use, or what might be living in there. So that's one of the things that I'm going to have a look at today. We'll have a look at some pond wildlife that you might have if you have a pond. So I thought we could start off with the pond. Obviously, there are the obvious things within a pond. You might get your frogs and toads, and on the right we've got a little tiny newt there that's just developing. And again, in the spring and the summer, some of the more obvious creatures might be these dragonflies and damselflies, the adults that would be flying around. But there's a huge amount of learning that can be done looking in the pond, actually, to look at some of the invertebrates that are actually in the water there. And that can be done any time of year. So some of the things that you might come, well, to start with, actually, if you haven't got the space for a pond, you can just create a very tiny mini wildlife pond, which you could just use, you know, an old washing up bowl, for example. And this is quite a nice resource, a watch resource, which you can find online, which just shows you really how you would go about doing that and what you could put in it. And really, you know, you'd be surprised at what actually does find its way there. So that, and I have seen a very small after school club with a very small space actually build one of these, and they did have quite a few things come to visit this. So So it does actually work if you've only got a tiny space. So the guide that we tend to use if you're looking at fresh water with the children is this one. So we like to use these Field Studies Council guides, the FSC guides. There are a whole range of different guides for everything from butterflies to birds, to ladybirds, you know, a whole range. And this one, the Freshwater Name Trail, is the one that we tend to use for ponds and rivers. So it's very, very easy to use. Obviously, for very small children, so perhaps, you know, years 1 and 2, for example, what we might do instead is produce very simple, we've got some very simple A4 sort of laminated guides that have just got some nice simple pictures of some of the common invertebrates that they might find. But if you want them to start to be able to use a key as you move up through the years, then this is a really nice one for them to use. You'll see that you start on that front page and it asks you a question, and each time you answer yes or no, and then that should take you off to the next question, and eventually you should arrive at the species that you've got. And it's not too difficult to use, and you've also got all of the pictures on it. So, you know, you don't just have to go through the key, but you can have a look across the pictures and you might instantly find what you have. And I'd say that most things you come across in a pond or a stream are going to be on this guide. So it is actually really, really useful. Now, some of the things that you might find, we've got some pictures here. Now, I took these photos. I often say to people, all I've used is my phone and a clip-on lens, which I think cost me less than £10 on Amazon. And you can get this little clip-on lens, clips over your camera on your phone, and it allows you to zoom right in so you can look at the detail, which is really, really nice. Sometimes if these creatures are moving about within your white tray, then I would put on a little spoon and take a photograph of them. So within a pond, then obviously you're going to need your nets and your white trays, and you tend to do a figure of 8 with the net. Obviously you don't get in the pond, you just sort of sit on the side and do your figure of 8 dip and put it into your tray of water, and then you can have a look at what you found. If you're out on a field visit perhaps and you're looking in a stream, then you can do a kick sample. And if it's a small shallow stream, so we tend to use 1 or 2 on our sites in Winchester where the children can actually get in and do the kick sample, and again they would put their finds into a tray and have a go identifying them. And you'll see these 3 creatures here are fairly easy to find on that sheet that we've just looked at. So if I go back, so if we have a look at this first Ramshorn Snail, you can see on the left that very first question that you would be asked would be whether it lives in a case or a shell. And if you follow along to yes, is the case made of leaves, twigs, sand, or stones? No, well then that takes you straight to the mollusks. And you can see from those pictures quite clearly that we've got a Ramshorn snail. So hopefully the children should be able to see that there are different types of snails there. And if, of course, we go to the second question where it says, is the case made of leaves, twigs, sand, or stones? And the answer is yes, then that is our second creature, which was the Caddisfly larva. So this one in the middle is a cased Caddisfly larva. And these are really fascinating creatures that basically make cases by sticking bits of gravel or sand or twigs or plants together to make a tube. And they then live inside this tube. They've got hooks on the end of their body, and they carry this tube around and they grow, and they add stones to enlarge the tube as they grow. And it's amazing camouflage for them, and obviously protection against predation. And you do find these in both ponds and in streams. So again, that one we can identify fairly easily from that guide. Now this third one on the right here is a little bit more tricky to use the guide to identify, but the children could be sort of looking at the key features. So they would probably spot straight away that there are 3 tails. And they could also be looking that there are 6 legs there. Now, if we go back again, oops, wrong direction. If we go back, following the key, if we take the no at the very first question, whether we've got a shell or a case, if we go no, does it have legs? Then we've got yes. We go on to the next page. Does it have jointed legs? Well, if we looked quite closely, we could see that they were jointed. So we go yes. Does it have more than 6? Well, no, it had 6. So we continue along that line. Does it have 1 or more tails? Yes, it does. Does it have more than 1 tail? Yes, it does. Does it have 2 tails? No, it doesn't. We're carrying on up. Are the tails longer than the width of the body? Yes, they are. Are the tails thin and hairy, body often with gills along each side? Yes. So it takes us to a mayfly nymph, and that is what we've got. So you can see this is the mayfly nymph. So it's got these 3 tails, it's got jointed legs, and if you look quite closely along the abdomen there, you can just about see the gills running down the side. So then obviously we can talk to the children about those gills and why it needs to have those gills. There are lots and lots of questions. We can be talking about life cycles, adaptations to the environment that these creatures are living in. You know, the camouflage is really good with the middle one, the caddisfly. Lots of different adaptations, lots of different things to talk about. And that guide is a very simple guide which covers all of these creatures and really does work quite well to identify them all. So the sort of links to the curriculum, you can see I've listed some of them here. You know, and we can be talking about all these things, food chains and life cycles and adaptations, like I've said. Now, I really like this sort of sorting tray that somebody's developed on the picture on the left there. Now, they've created quite a complicated, I suppose, ID sheet to go underneath it, which actually sorts out the mayflies into different types of mayfly and goes into quite a lot of detail. But you could actually produce your own, which could be far simpler. You could, for example, simply get the children to sort these creatures, you know, by the number of legs that they have, whether they have legs, how many legs they have, you know, whether they have a case or whether they have a shell, and all of these sorts of things. You can get the children sorting out the creatures, classifying them, and looking closely at their body parts. This creature in the middle is a freshwater hog louse, which is very similar to a wood louse, so a crustacean. So again, the children could be looking at that, looking at the number of legs and understanding the differences between all of these creatures. And then the creature on the right is actually a stonefly nymph. So that's again a very close-up picture with that lens. So quite a lot of links we can make there to the curriculum. And if you have a pond in your school grounds, you know, you can do all of this in the grounds, and that's absolutely great. There's a lot that you can find in there. So if I was looking at, you know, some of these creatures with the children, you know, the sort of things that I think we would be asking would be, you know, with these ones here, what do they all have in common, for example? And they might then spot the number of legs. So they all are insects, they all have those 6 legs. And again, they've all got the 3 tails. So that tells us that these are mayfly nymphs. And they would hopefully spot with these pictures, or if you're out doing this outside, you might spot an adult. So they might see here that there is one that's different because it has wings. So this is quite nice. We've quite often in the summer done dipping and actually been lucky enough to see mayflies emerge as adults. So you've got really good opportunities there to talk about life cycles And we can explain that these nymphs live in the water for a couple of years, and then they hatch out as an adult. They shed their skin and become an adult. And that's what this one is with the wings that you can see there. In fact, some species of these bigger mayfly nymphs here, they live for 2 years as a nymph in the water, but they actually hatch out as an adult, and they only live for a day as an adult, because all they do is mate and lay eggs, and then they die. So really quite fascinating life cycles that we can talk about. And we've got our dragonflies and damselflies as well. So, you know, if we're working in the summer months, then we're more likely to see some of these other creatures as the adult stage. So if you're working in the winter, you can certainly do the dipping in the winter, because you will find those nymphs in the water at any time of year. But during the spring and summer, then you might be lucky enough to see them actually flying as adults. So we've got this lovely golden ringed dragonfly on the left here, and we've got a damselfly down the bottom, and we've got this lovely banded Demazol, which is a type of damselfly at the top. And on the right hand side, you can see the nymphs of those creatures. So the one on the far right is a dragonfly nymph, and so the children would be able to see that. Certainly in the pond, in the water, you're quite likely to find dragonfly nymphs, and they're really quite interesting predators, because they can unhinge their jaw and they can catch their prey, and it's called a mask. They actually unhinge it to catch their prey. So they're quite amazing predators, both as a nymph and as an adult, because the adults will obviously fly around and hunt for other flying prey. And then the Demazol at the top there, the Demazol Nymph, is that one on the right next to it there. And they look quite like a stick insect in water. Once again, they've got 6 legs and they have got 3 tails. But these damselfly tails are a little bit more leaf-like. So they're not like the mayfly tails, which are pointed and thinner. These are a bit more like almost blades of grass, kind of a little bit wider. So that's the damselfly nymph. And again, we can use all of this to talk about classification using keys. We can talk about food chains and life cycles and all of those sorts of things. So lots and lots of learning opportunities. So, and again, you know, these are more interesting creatures, you know, and the sort of things that we might ask: what do we think? Do they have any ideas what these creatures are, for example, and how might they breathe underwater? So there are quite a few creatures in the pictures here. This one on the left there are 2 creatures there, you can probably see. The bigger one underneath is a water scorpion, and they are quite interesting. Everybody wants to find a water scorpion. Unfortunately, the picture doesn't show the whole extent of it, but it has got this long tube coming off the back end, which looks like it might sting you, but actually that long tube is a snorkel. So these creatures use that to poke it up above the water so that they can breathe. So therefore, these creatures can live in quite muddy, still areas of water where there isn't a lot of oxygen, because they can actually stick it up above the water. Whereas those mayfly nymphs, for example, that have the gills, they need very well oxygenated, clean water to breathe. So you will find them in lovely, clean, fast flowing water generally. And then on the right hand side, we've got this diving beetle. Now I think that could be a couple of leeches on its back actually, but they have an interesting way of breathing. A lot of the beetles, and including water boatmen, if you find them, if you look at them under the water, you'll see sometimes they've got a silver sort of underneath their body. You'll see like a silver bubble, and that's an air bubble that they take down under the water. So they can actually take that down. So that's their way of breathing the oxygen that they need whilst they're under the water. So these creatures have all got different ways of doing that, and we can actually observe that when we do this pond dipping, which is really, really good. So some of those adaptations that I've just mentioned, and so obviously we've got those creatures that have got gills, and like I say, they need clean, well oxygenated water. You can actually, if you look on the back of that FSC guide, there's something called a biotic index, and these creatures are all scored. You can score them out of 10, and the ones that you'll see on the back of that sheet, they all have a score, and the ones that have a high score need clean, well oxygenated water. So they would be things like the mayfly nymphs, because they have gills, they need that. The ones that have a lower score don't need really clean, well oxygenated water, and those would be these things like these mosquito larvae and the rat-tailed maggots and water scorpions, because they have other ways of obtaining their oxygen through their snorkels, so they would get lower scores. So from doing a sort of scoring system, you can work out how clean the water might be. So that's another nice thing that you can do with some of the slightly older children. You can actually start to bring some maths into it, because they need to add up the scores for each of the species they found and divide by the number of different species. And that then gives them this average score, which tells them out of 10 how clean the water is. 10 being very, very clean. So it's not often that high, but it's a really good thing for them to do. And then we caught the beetles and the water boatmen, we call those the scuba divers, because they take down the air with them. So there's some nice breathing adaptations there that we can talk about. So anybody got any questions so far at all? No? Okay. So I'll just do a couple more on the pond sort of and stream wildlife. Again, a few more interesting things that we can sort of talk to the children about. So these Caddisfly larvae, which live, as I say, in both ponds and streams, they're quite interesting because different species of Caddisfly use different materials to build their tubes, and you can actually identify which species you have by looking, in some cases, at the tubes. In some cases it's harder than that actually, and you need to look closely at the creature inside with a microscope, so we don't tend to do that with the children. Also, I was just put in the chat that Oksana, you've got 3 questions. Do you want to ask them now? That's absolutely fine. If you want to unmute yourself.
Okay, about the questions, I was listening. I have a washing basin in my forest, quite deep soil. So we have 3 problems, as I've noticed. The first problem, in summer, the water is evaporated quite quickly. So we'll try to put water, but nobody lives here because it's evaporating. In winter, and today, it's a rainwater, so it's okay. But the color is so brown, and I think smell as well. So I was thinking how often we need to change the water if it is winter, because I tried to have rainwater. I didn't want to take from my water barrel, which I have in the forest. And the third one, when it was nearly dry, but there was water, I have foxes in the forest, and they did poo there. So now every day, every morning I come there, now it's clean. So I'm just thinking, I wanted this, I have no success and to achieve this, because foxes made really, it could be next time as well, because if no water or just a little, it can realize.
So the foxes, did you say they're pooing in the?
Yes.
Oh dear.
Yes, actually, I have a video camera in my forest, and I have 3 foxes.
They're pooing in the bowl. Oh, I don't know if there's much you can do about that. That's a really tricky one, isn't it? Goodness.
Yes, that's
And
why I
if
keep
no,
eyes clean.
sorry, if nobody lives there over the summer, then I guess you can't top it up. So I guess there isn't anything you could do if there is nobody there to top it up. You know, I don't think there's much you could do. Sometimes when you put a new pond in, it does initially become quite green with algae and with duckweed and things, because to start with, it might have, if especially if you perhaps used tap water, but I think you said, you know, you tend to have rainwater there. Initially, there might be a bit of an influx of nutrients, and that can sometimes make a bit of an algal bloom, but that does generally settle down after a while. And with pond water, you know, in your own garden, then I don't think it's really necessary to change that water, because what you want is to have a balance. You want to have oxygenating plants in there, and you want to have, you know, everything in there which keeps it sort of filtered and clean, if you like. And that obviously is going to be harder to achieve in a very small washing up bowl kind of sort of space. So I think that would be harder to achieve. So I think it would be, and if you're not able to top it up in the summer, and now if you've got foxes pooing in it as well, I think that's quite a tricky challenge, actually. Very difficult. I don't know the answers, other than, you know, if I was treating it as a small pond, then I would be, I mean, I have a very, very tiny pond in my garden, and I have got
the video.
Okay, I've got oxygenating plants in it, and it seems to be okay. So I think putting the oxygenating plants, and somebody else, Annette's asking about which oxygenating weeds. Well, the one I've used is hornwort, which is very, very good. And I've got that in there, and that really does seem to help to keep it clean. And I've got a few other bits and pieces, and other wildlife has sort of come along. But if you have foxes using it as a latrine, which I've not heard of before, then obviously
only one. It was one, but now I'm really scared that it happens again. So it was
just once, only once. Okay, well maybe just see how that goes. But it's very hard. I would suggest putting some oxygenating plants in it to try and keep the water clean. But if you're not able to top it up in the summer, you might just have to accept that it will dry out in the summer, and there's not much you can do about that, unfortunately. So not probably the perfect answer, but, you know, I think maybe the best you can do in that situation, really.
I know. We call it a pond, but it's just now a green washing, just from plastic, but it's full of water. But I just checked today, nobody lives here, because I don't know why. I was thinking, maybe I need to change.
Are there any plants in it at all?
No plants. It's because the depth is only 8 inches. Yes, okay. Or
right.
18. I'm not good in inches. Okay, so that's the depth, about 20 centimeters, 8 inches. So it's not a deep one.
No.
And a little bit more than half a meter, maybe 80 centimeters. It's standard plastic, green one. And the question is, the soil is quite deep, so it's really isn't a pit. So I said, wow, it's a good pond place.
So is there soil in the washing up bowl? The water? No,
it's around.
Right, okay, fine. Yeah, I think perhaps you could purchase some oxygenating weed to put in it to help it, maybe. I think that might be a good idea. And Emily says in the chat, when the pond level drops in the summer, it's best to top up with tap water. Collected rainwater is not available in the school. Oh, is it? Sorry, is it best to top up with tap water? Collected rainwater is not available in the school, or leave it? That's a very good question, actually, and that is open to discussion. Some people prefer to leave it alone and just let it do its own thing and see if, you know, some creatures can be adapted to that lower water level. Some people really don't want that to happen, so they will add water. I think you can add tap water, but it may well be then that you end up with a bit of an algal bloom because of some of the nutrients that are in that tap water. So rainwater is ideal. I wonder if you could set up a rainwater butt, maybe, I don't know, so that you could collect the rainwater in that way to add it to the pond. That would be the ideal solution, I think, probably.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I ask a question, please?
Yeah, of course.
We have a fairly decent sized pond at school. We've just been in its sort of area and sort of clearing some of the weeds and brambles and things back to sort of see what's actually there. And our PTA are going to try and raise money to make it more of a wildlife garden.
Okay.
But the pond, like that previous person, it does pretty much dry up in the summer. But when we were clearing the day, I actually saw a newt come to the surface the other day, which was very exciting. And I know we have seen them before in there, and they're just the smooth newts. But the PTA are asking if it would be worth spending the money on like clearing out completely and relining it. But I don't know if that's bad.
Yes.
Or
no, I would actually. Is it lined with a butyl liner? Do you know, like the plastic black liner?
Honestly, it's been there for 20 odd years. I don't know. And it's
so it
very
might be, I guess the liner might be punctured. Is that punctured? Is that what you're thinking?
it may be possibly, yeah. Or it's just so I don't even know what the liner was. I don't know whether it was concrete or whatever they did all those many years ago. But would it disturb the newts and whatever's living in there too much if we were to sort of like clear it all out and start again?
I think what you would need to do, as long as there are not great crested newts, because they're protected by law, if you had great crested newts, you'd have to get permission to do anything. But I think that if the liner needs replacing, then I think it would be good to do it. And I think that the best time of year is to do that now. So autumn, winter, because that's the least disturbing time to do work like that. So I think that if you did it over the autumn, winter, then I think, I think you should, because it will then create a better habitat and you'll be able to use it as well. Because
I mean, the little sort of pond dipping decking is completely rotten, and so it was going to be a bit of a complete revamp, and it's a bit like trying to say, well, if we're going to do it, we might as well try and do it properly.
Yeah, I would definitely, and I'd do it over the autumn, winter, and hopefully, if you could get it done, I guess I don't know how long it would take. It depends, doesn't it? But if you could get it done in a day, and put everything to one side, then any creatures that were there can hopefully scramble back in once you've got your new one up and running, basically.
And because it's a bit wetter now, it does actually have water in it currently. Is it, you have to like dig it out by hand, or can you go in with small machinery?
Well, as long as there's no great crested newts, you can do what you want to do, whatever's easier. I mean, by hand is obviously less damaging and less disturbing for wildlife. I would say, but you could possibly pierce it even more to get rid of all the water first, and then take that liner, take it out that way, possibly.
I just think that everybody that currently works at the school wasn't there when it was done before, so we're all a bit, into the unknown, really.
So, well, this is the time of year to do it. So I would say, if you think that liner isn't working, then I would say go for it. And if the pond dipping decking is falling to bits as well, then maybe just do a revamp of the whole thing. I think that would be a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, right, so these caddisfly, again, this is just a couple more slides on what you can find and the sort of things that we might be asking the children, looking at the materials that the caddis are using to make their cases. And then an interesting one, do they know how they stick them together? Does anybody know? Anyone like to hazard a guess how they stick them together?
I really don't know.
It's actually bee. So it is a sort of silk produced from their salivary glands. So that's how they stick their cases together. So, and then something else, if your pond is particularly muddy and maybe, you know, not got the oxygenating weeds in it, and it's a bit stagnant, you might find some of these. And, you know, you probably guessed that it's red because this actually contains hemoglobin to help it absorb oxygen. So you tend to find these midge larvae, that's what this is, in those areas that don't have so much oxygen. So again, another adaptation really to coping with lower oxygen levels. And then we've just mentioned newts actually. So, you know, this is, I mean, again, these sort of questions, what do we think this is? This is actually a newt tadpole. And it's really interesting looking at these creatures closely, because you can see the gills on the side, these feathery structures on the side. So, you know, when we talk about life cycles, children often look at frogs, don't they? And you look at how frogs change, you know, how tadpoles become frogs. We don't often look at newts in that way, but they do the same. You know, they will change from a very tiny newt tadpole through to an adult newt. And that's another interesting thing that we can look at in a pond. And I do hear a lot of people say they do have newts in their pond. And the newts will leave the pond in the winter, well, after they've bred, and they will hibernate under logs and rocks near to the pond. And frogs and toads will do the same. So it's really useful to have a log pile near to your pond for those creatures to be able to hibernate. In fact, it's worth it being aware, if you are doing work in your pond over winter, that sometimes frogs will actually hibernate at the bottom of the pond under the water. So it's always worth checking that you don't have any big frogs in there before you do any work actually. So some of the resources then, we've talked about these Field Studies Council guides, and this is another one on the left here for reptiles and amphibians. So talking about our newts, this is a really nice one that shows you really very clearly how to tell the difference between those three newts there. And you have to sort of look underneath their tummy and you will see some really lovely markings. And that will help us to identify which species we have. The great crested newt, as I said, is protected by law. So if you had those, you would need a license actually to handle them, and you would also need permission to do anything to your pond. They're very big and they are quite rare, so they are protected by law. Something else that's quite nice to use are these spotters guides, which again are produced by the Wildlife Trust, and these are Wildlife Watch spotters guides, and there are a whole load of them online. And in fact, you can produce your own, depending on which species you have in your school grounds. You can make your own spotters guide online and print that out for the children to use when they're in the school grounds to see what it is that's there, what they can find. Now for Wildflower Id, a lot of people worry that they don't know how to identify wildflowers. Now in school grounds, you may be surprised that you may have quite a few wildflowers. Now, they may be the more common type of wildflower, but they are still wildflowers. There might be areas around the edge of the playing field, for example, that are left a little bit longer, that might have a few different wildflowers. And the resources that we tend to use to identify wildflowers would be these here. Again, the FSC guide to grass and plants is very, very good. This would have the very common plants that you're likely to find anywhere. The number 2 guide is the one that's specifically for chalk, chalk and limestone. And then if you want more detail, we tend to use this Wildflower Key, which is a book by Frances Rose. And that is also brilliant, but obviously it gives you a lot more detail. Now, with the Wildflower ID, I always say to people, if they want to have a go at learning how to identify wildflowers, the best way is to try and learn a few of the common family groups. So if we have a look at these, you'll see here that actually 70% of all our native British species belong to these top 20 family groups. So if you pick, I mean, we won't look at grasses because that's a very complicated, tricky one to look at. But if we pick some of these top family groups, then you would find a huge number of different wildflowers, common weeds, you might call some of them, fall within those groups. And if you can get to know what a family group looks like, what the characteristics are of some of those, then you'll be able to spot plants that fit into those family groups, and that makes it much easier to identify. So what I thought I'd do is just talk to you about a couple of really common plant family groups that we've got here in the UK that you're really likely to see in the school grounds, or just in the garden, or on the roadside verge, you know, and why they are in that family. So the Pea family is a really common family, and there are lots of plants that belong to this family. Things like clover, things like gorse and broom, and all the trefoils, and the vetches, you know, lots and lots of really common plants. They're nitrogen fixing, so they're really amazing that they can actually fix nitrogen from the air and turn it into usable nitrogen. So they actually enrich the soil that they're in, and they are in fact planted for that reason in fields by farmers in some cases. They have compound leaves, and what that means is basically the leaf is made up of small leaflets, as you can see in that left picture. And the key thing really is the flower. Every flower in the Pea family is made up of this particular arrangement of petals. So there's a big petal called the standard. There are 2 petals at the bottom that form a keel, like the keel of a boat. And then there are 2 on the side which form the wings. Now, if you tease apart any pea flower, that is exactly how the flower will be arranged. Even if you looked at a clover head, that clover head is not one flower, but that's a whole lot of florets. And if you teased apart each tiny one, then you'd find that arrangement of petals just in miniature on the top of that flower head in every single one of those little florets. They're insect pollinated, and when they go to seed, they form the classic pea seed pod. So they're really characteristic because of that. And once you sort of recognize that, you'll start to see members of the Pea family all over the place. And you'll see some here. So you can see we've got common birdsfoot trefoil. We've got gorse. You can see they've gone to seed there. And the one at the top, which is obviously gorse in flower. We've got the red clover. So what I mean is every single tiny one of those little florets on that flower head, each one of them, the petals are arranged in that particular way that I've just mentioned. We've got samfoin, lots of different members of the pea family. So really distinctive flower shape. And if you wanted to look at it further, they've all got 10 stamens, you know, joined into a tube, and various other things that are common to that particular family of plants. Another family, which again, we're probably going to find all over the place, includes things like white dead nettle, wild thyme, wild marjoram, things like that. So this dead nettle family, again, it's really characteristic because they have square stems, believe it or not. If you find a white dead nettle and you feel the stem, it's actually square. It's not round. And the leaves are all arranged opposite each other up the stem. But the other thing that's really characteristic is that they are all aromatic. So they all smell. Now, they don't necessarily all smell nice, like wild thyme and wild marjoram. White dead nettle has got a distinctive smell, but I wouldn't say it was a nice smell, but it does have a smell. So they are all scented. So these are quite interesting characteristics that you'll start to sort of maybe see plants and think, oh, that kind of looks a bit like the dead nettle family. And then you can have a look more closely if you wanted to, and you'd see things like, it says on my list here, the corolla, which is basically all that means is all of the petals together. The corolla is 5-lobed. So the petals are all joined actually at the base to form this tube, but they have 5 lobes or 5 pieces to them, which look like 5 petals, but they're actually all joined to form a tube. And then the calyx, which is this little bit at the bottom of the petals, has got these kind of teeth. It's got 5 teeth. So these are all characteristics of this family of plants. So again, it's all about learning the characteristics, and then you get to know the family, and then you start to recognize other plants that might be in that family. And then if you looked in that book I mentioned earlier, you can go straight to that family of plants and find what you've got much, much easier, much quicker. So other sort of, again, Wildlife Watch produced these really nice, very simple guides. So we've got autumn leaves here, so we can use those to go out and look for different species of plant, different species of tree and shrub in school grounds. And again, we can look at the links here. I know that we need to cover plants, working scientifically, evolution and inheritance. There's lots of links that we can make when we're having a look at plant identification. And as I said, you can produce your own spotter's guide. So you could have a go at identifying some of the plants in the school grounds and then produce a spotter's guide specifically for your school grounds. And the children could use that to go out and have a look at what they've got out there. So then the next thing I just wanted to talk about was the link between some of the insects and the plants that we've got in the grounds as well, because there's some really nice links and some very common plants just you can find anywhere that will actually produce a lot of learning. So butterflies are really fascinating because they need specific plants for their caterpillars to feed on. So it's really important that they have those particular plants. There are some really good links with very common plants. So for example, nettles. Nettles are great because they are the food plant of a number of butterflies. So for example, the comma and the peacock. So you can see this peacock caterpillar on the right. So nettles are amazing. They have caterpillars for these butterflies on them, but they do also often have a lot of other insects on them. What I tend to do with children is obviously not go handling them and walking through them. But if we've got a patch of nettles, then quite often I'll just get the children just to sit next to the nettles and just observe them, just look at them and see what they can see walking around on them. You know, you'll find ladybirds, shield bugs, caterpillars, all sorts of things. And it's really nice to talk to them about the fact that they have these stinging hairs on them, and to sort of talk about how the creatures deal with those stinging hairs, really. And I think nettles are really quite important. Obviously, we don't want them to take over, but if you've got a patch of nettles, then it can be really nice just to look at them and to see which insects actually use those nettles. You can also make nettle tea, and you can also make nettle string if you really wanted to use them in various ways. Another really common plant is garlic mustard, and you find this growing along the roadside. You find it in the garden. It's a member of the cabbage family. It's edible and it does smell slightly of garlic, but it's the food plant of the orange tip butterfly. So the orange tip lays its eggs on this, and you can see the egg here. Again, I took this picture with that little lens that you clip onto the phone. So during lockdown, I decided to spend a bit more time, like many people, just observing what was in my own garden. And I knew that there were a couple of garlic mustard plants right at the back. I think it was last year. So I just went out to have a close look. I just sat there looking, and I actually found these orange tip eggs. So it was just simply by looking closely that I found them. And so then I watched them over a few weeks, and I watched the caterpillars hatch and grow. And then obviously they eventually became the orange tip butterfly that you can see on the right here. And another plant that's really beneficial is dandelion. We let the dandelions flower in the garden, and they were absolutely covered with pollinators. We had solitary bees, honeybees, bumblebees, and different butterflies feeding on the dandelions. Plant Life did a really great webinar all about the nectar and pollen score for a lot of common plants, and dandelion was very, very high scoring. It's very, very good for our insects. So that's a nice one to leave flowering. More common plants. So this is an apple tree, actually. This is apple blossom on the left with a common blue butterfly or holly blue butterfly feeding on it in April, I think that was. The brimstone butterfly in the middle there hibernates over winter as an adult. Hibernates as an adult and then emerges quite early in the year. That's probably the first one that we see flying, actually. But something just to mention, one plant which many people don't realise how valuable it is for wildlife is ivy. And that's what these two pictures, the next two along, show you with the bees and the hoverfly. Ivy is one of our most important flowering plants because it flowers very late. It's just finished flowering now. It flowers at the end of the season when insects are looking for that last top up of food before they hibernate. So it's crucial. So on an autumn sunny day, you will see ivy flowers covered in pollinators, covered in bees, hoverflies, solitary bees, honeybees, bumblebees, everything that's looking to finish feeding before it hibernates. So it's really important. It's evergreen, so it will also be a great place for butterflies like the brimstone to hibernate in over winter. It provides nest sites for birds and also roosting sites for bats. So it's really, really important plant. And most schools, most people have got a patch of ivy somewhere on a fence, maybe, you know, somewhere on a hedge that they can go and just observe. And I found a very good, really good ID sheet recently. Got it behind me. I'm just going to grab it. See who. I'm just going to see who produced it. So University of Sussex, and it's called Appreciating Ivy and its Insects. I don't know if you can see that, but it's absolutely covered in all the different types of pollinators that you could find on ivy. So I think ivy is a brilliant one for us to observe. And what I always say is that even if we're looking at ivy, we're looking at nettles, or if we're looking at a wildflower patch, I really think that observation is really important. So not rushing in with sweet nets, for example, and trying to sort of walk through it and see what the children can see, but sometimes just standing or sitting at the edge of the wildflower patch and just looking at what they can see. And I think they'll find a lot more than if they're rushing through necessarily with a sweet net. You know, it's just nice just to sit and observe from the outside sometimes. And again, the dandelion, I love dandelions. And I think I mentioned log piles a few times and leaf litter and insect homes. you know, they're all really important, because then you've got different types of creatures that you might find in there: beetles, beetle larvae, wood lice, various things like that. And you've got more wildlife watch resources. Again, over here you can see that you can use, and there are FSC guides also to look at leaf litter and to look at bugs on bushes. That's what another one of them is called. Just a few pictures of some of the insects from my garden, really. The oil beetle, which I realise is quite unusual, but we're lucky we have them in the garden. And they've got quite an interesting association with solitary bees. They actually nest in holes in the ground, like the solitary bees, quite near to the solitary bees' nests. Their larvae hatch, the oil beetle larvae hatch. They climb up a flower, and when a solitary bee flies to the flower to feed, the oil beetle larvae grab hold of the solitary bee, and the solitary bee flies back into its own burrow to feed its young, taking the oil beetle larvae with it. And then the oil beetle larvae is a parasite and will feed on the bee larvae and the bee food. So really interesting associations that can go on just on your lawn, actually. And then we've got ladybird on ivy and a hoverfly there as well. So just all insects taken with that little lens you can clip onto your phone, just in the garden, really. So just observing what there is in the spring and summer. And birds, in January, the RSPB do the big garden bird watch. So that's something really good that children can take part in, especially if you've got bird feeders in the school grounds that the children can watch. I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat. So yeah, Emily's got a question about leaf litter. Go for it. Gives me a moment to have a drink.
Hello. So in the school nature garden that I look after, we've got quite a few overhanging trees from the path that runs alongside it and also within the garden. So it gets very covered in leaves in the autumn. So at the moment I do a mixture of, to keep the children warm, so I run a lunchtime nature club in there. I have them doing some raking and raking leaf piles with the idea that, you know, it can let light through to the grass, etc. And also perhaps the animals can maybe, I don't know if they'd hibernate in the leaf pile. But then we also have the problem of, we net the pond, but it's not entirely netted. So we have the problem of leaves blowing into the pond. So I sort of like, I guess the question is, how tidy do you keep a wildlife garden? Should we be leaving the leaves everywhere? Or
I do. Yes.
Do?
I on my own garden, and the grass never dies. Well, I don't. I'd say it doesn't die. It comes back every year. Okay. I don't ever rake leaves.
Right.
And I just before it got dark, I watched a jay just now foraging in the leaves. So I leave all the leaves on the lawn.
Okay.
And we get a lot of birds foraging in that leaf litter, looking for the insects that are living in there. But if you wanted to make 1 or 2 leaf piles with some of the leaves, then that would be an added bonus, because other creatures might hibernate underneath that pile.
Okay.
So maybe a combination of the two would be really good. And I would probably clear them from the pond though, because they will rot down and add nutrients. So so I would do that though. Yeah.
Okay. And so the leaves that are, because there's a hedge around the pond and that gets full of leaves all sort of under the hedge. Should I clear those out? I was wondering about leaving those in case there were creatures from the pond hibernating there, or do you think clear them out?
So clear them out from where? Sorry, under the hedge.
Under the hedge that runs around the pond.
I would leave them if they're not in the pond. Then I'd leave them there. Yeah, next to it. That's fine. I would. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Would it be possible to give a link or resource for the lens? Yes, that would be fine. What I can do, because I've got your email addresses and there are only 4 or 5 of you, I could easily send you that by email through Eventbrite afterwards. So shall I do that? Otherwise it will take me a few minutes to find the link. I'm just going to make a note of that so I can send the link to the lens. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, for under £10, really can do an amazing job. The only challenge, you've got to get very close and you've got to get whatever you're taking a picture of to stay still. So that's the only real challenge. Okay, so I'm just checking on the time. Yeah, we're okay. We've just gone 5. So I know it's sort of booked, I think, until 5:30, but probably won't go on quite that long, and then we can have questions again if we need to. So what I suggest always, if you're going to start looking at the school grounds, is maybe to start with to do a bit of a survey, and find out what's already there. And you can do this with the children. There are different methods you can use. If you want to do some small mammal surveying, you can use Longworth Traps, and those are traps that you set up, humane traps obviously, for small mammals to go into at night, and then you can check them in the morning to see what you found. We usually would set them up 2 nights before you're going to check them, and set them open so that the creatures can go in with food and bedding in there and get used to them. And then the next night you'd set them ready to shut, so you catch your small mammal, and then early the next morning you check them and see what you've got living in your school grounds. And you'll probably find things like bank voles and wood mice and things like that. So that's something that you could do. You might consider nest boxes with cameras in, which are really great fun for the children to see. Sweep nets, like you can see in this picture in the middle. If you've got a wildflower meadow area, then they are great in the summer months to use, but not if it's wet, because obviously everything gets a bit squashed and damaged. And I'm always a bit hesitant about overusing them and overusing an area, because it's likely to get trampled. So as I say, I tend to use them minimally, and rather walking around the edge of an area, observing, and possibly just using, each child having a bug pot with a magnifying lid and a paintbrush. And I always say to them, what on earth's my paintbrush for? And they always think, oh, we're going to do some artwork. No, the paintbrush is so that you can delicately put the creature into your pot, and then you can have a nice close look at it before you put it back on the plant. So sometimes, rather than sweep nets, I would just use paintbrushes and pots. So that's another nice idea that you can do. I've said torch because if you've got a pond, and if you want to look for newts, the evening is a really good time, and you can go out with a torch in the evening to look for newts. That's the best time to see them. Moth trapping, again, is a nighttime activity. You'd set up your lamp and you would let the moths come in and then check them in the morning. Reptile felt, pond dipping, we've talked about, photographs, and obviously sitting and watching and enjoying all of this is really important too. Just to mention, I think it's quite important to mention, we've talked a lot about science today, and what you can do out in your school grounds, what wildlife you might have there, and how that links with science. But it's really important to remember that all of this can link quite nicely to literacy and numeracy as well, and obviously art and design. And an example would be this storytelling example, where you could be asking the children to find objects outside in their school grounds, look at them closely, feel them, smell them, and think about what those objects could be in a story. For example, we've got here that the leaf could be a fairy boat, the acorn could be a pixie hat. And then they need to come up with a story using all of those items that they found, and tell that story to a friend, or create a story together as a group, perhaps. So there are so many different things you can do outside to link to, literacy, numeracy. You can do poetry, descriptive words, all kinds of things you can actually do outside with what you find, with some very basic items, actually. So really, just before we finish then, I suppose the last sort of few slides here are just really the South Downs slide, just to tell you that the training today, this was developed through the South Downs Education Network, and they've got over 100 centres and sites delivering activities. And what the network offers is actually all of these things here. So there are a lot of curriculum linked sessions that are offered covering all of these subjects, and now residential trips are happening again, which is really, really good. And by taking part today, then you've obviously helped to build learning outside the classroom, which we feel is really, really important. Obviously, it exposes children to, you know, all these different new environments, perspectives, possible career opportunities, and just being out in nature. We know there's huge health and well-being, positive, you know, benefits that come from it as well. So, and then the last bit here is just more information. If you wanted more information, then you can get that from all of these links here. And I've also been asked to mention that there is a travel grant for schools with more than 10% pupils eligible for free school meals. And you can claim up to £300 for travel to some of these South Downs sites. So that's just worth bearing in mind as well. So I think that is probably the last slide. So I will stop sharing, and I am amazed that my voice has actually lasted. So if anyone's got any other questions about anything, just having a look, I think I've mentioned everything that I'd planned to. Then yeah, fire away.
I've got so I work at a primary school in Totton and near Southampton, and I do outdoor learning. I'm a forest school leader trained, so I have a different class each afternoon. We have an amazing little bit of woodland, but is it, so we're planning on doing things like wildlife flower areas and things like that, and putting up bird boxes and things, but because the children come out into that area like every afternoon, is it a bit too busy for the wildlife to want to come? Should I push it a bit further back, like at the area, or will they come anyway?
Oh, it's always a bit of a balance, actually. It's a good question. I think that again, a mixture. I would have, you know, I'd encourage some of the wildlife into that area, but I'd also put some of your bird boxes and bird feeders and things a little bit further away, perhaps where the children could, you know, view from a bit more of a distance. So I think it's quite nice to have a mixture, really. The wildlife might come anyway, you know, into that area, but maybe if you can put a few bits further back as well, that would be really good, I think. Yeah,
okay. Otherwise, I don't want all the children's noise every afternoon to scare everything away. Otherwise, we're never going to see anything. I know we have had foxes in our grounds, and obviously we got the squirrels and the birds that are, you know, a bit more used to us. But to encourage more diverse, you know, birds and things, I just think maybe, yeah, like I say, put things a bit further away.
Yeah, you're right. Some of those creatures will not mind at all. Some of the birds will be fine, and the foxes. I know another school that has foxes visiting the school grounds, and I've seen them there myself in the day when the children were all outside in the grounds. So some creatures are quite brave, but some, like the jays that I mentioned earlier, are very, very shy. So if you're able to put bird feeders and things a bit further away as well, then it might also attract those shyer creatures, I would say.
Yeah. And another question is, just quickly, we've in the last couple of years have had the woodland trusts like tree packs, so we've planted sort of like hedging trees around the edge, so to try and encourage some of the other sort of pollinator plants in there. Is it, because at the moment just nettles and the sticky weed stuff tends to grow in amongst it, is it worth sort of clearing some of that back and trying to get in some of like the dead nettle families and those in there, or just leave it go crazy?
Yes, I would do. Usually if there are lots of nettles coming through, that means wherever you're planting it is quite fertile.
Yeah.
And so if you don't want those nettles, then I would definitely try and pull them out. Definitely try and get rid of them. And you're talking about in amongst the shrubs, are you, rather than out in? Yeah. So if you're talking about in amongst the shrubs, then obviously go for things that don't mind a bit of shade. As those shrubs grow, then it will be quite shady. So you probably want to have a little look and see things like primroses, for example, in the spring. Quite a few spring plants that grow in woodlands naturally would probably do quite well there. But you probably will, if it's quite fertile, you probably will need to control the nettles to start with.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else got any other questions? Yeah.
Okay. Just for the start, I bought all these ID sheets from Wildflower Traps. Honestly, I'm not using. Let's speak about mushroom. Now it's a mushroom season, yes, and we had mushroom hunting today with children. Say hello, mushroom, bye-bye, mushroom. I do remember the idea I bought that I don't have lots of mushrooms like fly agaric and others. What I thought I would suggest, because now I'm doing my identifications. I have 21 mushrooms already. I identified, took pictures, new poisonous, edible, non-edible. Some mushrooms are blocked because of the forms and others. But could it be possible? I don't know if it's a good idea if we can put the mushrooms, which can be, for example, the same, oh, probably it is this damaging angel. Oh no, it's ink cap. So if Wild Trust could put they slightly different, it's not only about mushrooms, it's about the trees as well. Look in the same species. And so children can see the difference. Because what the difference? Because even for me, even for iSeek, iNaturalist, I use this program. It's quite hard to identify it because it's more professional, mushrooms. Just like they look the same, yes, for example, bullets or shelf fungus, and it would be in one ID, okay? So for example, shelf fungus, it's only 6 groups, for example, say. If Wild Trust would do it more professionally, it would be nice. Shelf fungus, chicken mushrooms, hen mushrooms, Alfred's cake, and it would be so, how to explain, more useful. And then we have this and say, children, can you find that one exactly here? Or London plane, yes, this kind, sycamore, field maple, they look the same. And children say, it's a London plane. No, it's so if Wild Trust would put that, and then we can see the difference that the helicopter is this way, the other way. The same about, because some confusion. And even for me, it's hard to see this. Okay, I found the bees, I have these bees, and they can now identify where is a honeybee, where is a wasp. The same, but it's not from Worldwide Trust because we have beehive. So it would be nice, the confusion, because not all mushrooms I have, which I bought from Worldwide Trust, it would be like all confusions, and children can see the difference. You know what I mean, like London plain, sycamore, they look the same for children.
Yeah, no, I do understand. So you're sort of after really an ID guide that will show the similar species and the differences between those similar species.
Because we have Japanese camellia and rhododendron, and even teacher said, I said, no, it's camellia. I created exotic flowers and trees in my school. And then I used Bing, I used Microsoft, I used all these programs to tell me, it would be nice from Worldwide Trust.
I think it's almost beyond a sort of quick ID guide, isn't it, to do that? But in order to get that, you need a more detailed book, don't you, really? So the Francis Rose book will tell you the differences between the plants that look very similar. But I know what you mean. And there are people I've seen on Twitter, for example, that have produced really good guides to particular groups that look very similar. So I saw back in the spring, somebody produced a really nice picture to show the differences between cherry plum and blackthorn flowers, because they're so similar. And that was really good, but it's quite detailed, isn't it? And it's quite, I don't think there is a quick sort of ID guide that does that, actually. So it would be quite useful. Yeah, I will definitely make a note and see if I can find anything that does that, actually. So
And
you
I
mean
think
for fungi in particular?
no, I want the same. Look, I have London plane, I have field, maple field, I have sycamore. I know the difference, but we'll try if children can have that in one ID, because it's for me all the time. I do lots of projects, but I thought it would be more useful. And then children, look at this tree and tell me what tree is this? Who thinks it's London plane? They hear. Who thinks it's a maple field? What's the difference? It's all about the mushrooms as well. We have this shelf fungus as well, just shelf, for example, and find then bonnet, and what's the difference?
Yeah,
because they're slightly the same.
Have you used the FSE guide for the trees, the tree name trail?
I put on Amazon a box of 30 cards. I have lots of stuff, but you know, I would like this kind of just like the similar, the difference.
Yeah.
In one like window, in one phase, so children can see. Maybe
I see.
I'm asking too much.
I don't know, maybe. I mean, the tree name trail, I think, has some of those next to each other, but it has all of the others as well. So perhaps you need to develop one yourself.
I know it will be like the same. You know, there is a crow, which is black one, then a jay, which is the gray. And if somebody can put them together, because it would be easier for them to realize what exactly it is. What's the difference?
Yeah, no, I understand.
All birds fine, but if one bird, and what could be confusion with other birds, what will be confusion with other plants, and what will be confusion with other trees?
Sometimes some websites are quite useful for looking up species, and sometimes they'll have a section that says confusion species, and then you can look at the very similar species and see the difference, but that's generally on a website. But I'll have to look and see if I can find anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
It's a long project.
Anybody else got any other questions at all? No? Okay. So what I'll do then is send you a link to the little lens for taking photographs. And if you think of anything at all in the future, feel free to drop me an email. I'm always happy to answer anything. And this will be uploaded online, so you can always have a look again if you've forgotten anything, or find the slides online. So thank you for bearing with me with my mad disappearing voice.
That was lovely. Thank you. I hope you feel better soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was really useful.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.